Hey everyone, welcome to Redefining HR podcast. I'm your host, Lars Schmidt, and I am really excited to be back kicking off season 8 of the podcast with Liz Fosslien. Liz is Humu's head of communications and content. She's also a best-selling author with 2 books, No Hard Feelings and Big Feelings. And there's so much for us to explore, so I want to jump right into it. Liz, if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to have you open with an introduction for the audience.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So at Humu, we send nudges to employees at large organizations to help them take small steps that have a really big impact on how they feel and the people around them feel. And then that, combined with the books I've written, everything in my work is just how do we embrace emotion in a way that is effective, that helps us have more productive teams, support one another. It's not an invitation to become a feelings fire hose. That's always the question I get. Like, should I just start screaming and crying? No, but there's definitely...
Sometimes, right?
Yeah, sometimes,
Yeah.
Right, yeah. But there's a balance to strike between sharing, which builds trust, and then oversharing, which, especially if you're a leader, can undermine your authority.
Well, there's a lot that I want to get into in all of that, both your role at Humu and also, your books and just your creative process, because I imagine a lot of listeners are both familiar with your books and also your illustrations that you do with Liz and Mollie. And so I'm really excited to learn more about those. But let's kind of go back to the early days. You studied economics and math in college. What did you envision yourself doing at that time?
Yeah, so for context, my parents are both immigrants. They're very academic. They're very stoic. So I was definitely emotionally repressed and had a very strict view of what success looked like. I studied math and economics because I'm terrified of blood, so I couldn't be a doctor. So it was like, okay, well, doctor's out, so now it's lawyer or banker. And that was where I thought my career was going. So I got a job as an economic consultant, and it was... it checked all the boxes. It had like a very clear career path. I was making what I thought was a lot of money, put on the Banana Republic suit every day, went into a big, tall building, and I really hated it. The work, was sort of like cleaning up the mess of the 2009 financial crisis. I didn't find the work meaningful. We were at the behest of law firms, so I would often be in the office till 6, just sitting around. Then the work would come in and I would start and be in the office till 1. So there was very little work-life balance. There are just many things about that job, but it was shocking to me that I couldn't just power through. Like, I truly burnt out. I started having migraines and had to quit with nothing else lined up. And that for me was really being forced to confront the fact that, if you don't like what you do, you can't do it for that long. It's not really sustainable. And even if you are able to muddle through, you're not going to be successful.
Yeah. Was that kind of a turning point for you in your career? Like when you reached that point and you were clearly burned out and you left, and obviously your work since then, and certainly of late, has been more around evaluating and kind of exploring feelings at work, emotions at work, your work at Humu with nudges, explores that as well. Like, was there a moment where you kind of said, okay, like I had this dream of what I needed to be and what I should be that was kind of probably drilled into me from a young age. Now I need to do something different and maybe deconstruct some of what led me down that road to begin with?
Yeah, so it definitely wasn't a single moment of, this is what I need to do with my life. It was sort of a slow, forced reckoning. But I very much had operated under this idea that to be professional, you don't feel, you don't fuss, and you don't fail. And I was feeling, I had to quit my job, so I felt like I was fussing and I felt like I'd failed. And I think what actually was the big awakening moment for me was that after I quit, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I needed health insurance. I needed some income. So as a consultant, I'd been going to the Starbucks every day as a customer to just get out of the office. And I knew that Starbucks, if you worked there part-time, would offer you benefits. So I walked into the same Starbucks and was like, you know me as a customer. Do you have any barista openings? And I worked as a barista for about 7 months in Chicago. And Starbucks is so thoughtful about onboarding employees. It's retail, so there's high turnover, so they have to be thoughtful about how do you get someone up to speed quickly, but how do you get the team to work together. And then also, how do you create an emotional experience for customers? And that for me was this window into, oh, we don't need to keep emotions out of the workplace. They actually are hugely beneficial, both for things like employee experience and for, profit and making a brand that people really feel attached to. And so that was when I also started looking back at my consulting role and asking myself, what could I have done to make this more enjoyable or to make this work out a little longer so I didn't sort of hit the wall and crash and burn so hard? And things like going to my manager and saying, these are the aspects of work I really enjoy. Can I take on more of this work? It had never occurred to me that that was an option. I just was like very reactive. Here's the assignment. I do the assignment. I turn it in. What's the next assignment? Yeah, it was a slow process, but I think Starbucks was instrumental. And then also starting to really explore this, like, are there any actions I could have taken that I probably still wouldn't be a consultant, but that might have made it a better learning experience.
So in your current role now at Humu, you were one of the very early employees coming over when Laszlo Bach started the company. What drew you to Humu? How did that kind of align with your personal and professional interests at the time?
Yeah, so I think the company was like 20 people. It's now about 120 when I joined. And at the time I was writing my first book, No Hard Feelings, with my co-author, Mollie. And we had combed through the academic literature, interviewed a lot of academics, and we're starting to reach out to practitioners to see, okay, here's what the research says. What are people actually doing in the workplace? And I emailed Laszlo. I was familiar with his work at Google and honestly thought I would never get a response. And to his credit, he responded. And so I interviewed him for about an hour. And one of the things I found was that most people I interviewed had very good high-level advice, like I want people to be authentic. I want people to bring their whole self to work. Empathy is really important for leadership, which is wonderful. But my question was always, it's 9 a.m., it's Tuesday, I'm a manager. What if I'm newly promoted? What if it's not? What if I work at like an investment bank? What does vulnerability look like in that moment? I have no idea. And when I asked Laszlo, there was so much nuance in his answer. He was like, it depends on you. It depends on the culture. It depends on the people on the team. It depends on what executives reward within that organization. And so I just so appreciated the rigor in his responses. I remember leaving that meeting and just thinking, like, whatever I need to do with this company, I think I would learn so much from this individual. And so we stayed in touch. And when the book came out, I sent him a copy. And then again, I think I got very lucky that it was this mutual, like, this is really in line with what Humu is doing. So I ended up joining as one of their first nudge writers. So my first job was just writing a lot of the nudges, many of which we still send to employees.
Yeah, and let's talk about the nudges for a moment, because for viewers and listeners that may not be familiar with Humu and nudges and kind of their role in performance and engagement, maybe if you could just give an overview of like how Humu uses nudges, and then if there's something maybe that surprised you about a particular nudge and the reaction that would cause from employees.
Yeah, so nudges are short science-backed suggestions, so they don't take away any choice. You don't have to act on them, but hopefully they're convincing enough that you do. And they really break down big goals into mini milestones. So the goal when we're writing nudges is that it should never be unclear what to do. So even if we say, like, give specific feedback, we'll then give, like, here's a couple sentences that you can use, or phrases or frameworks, to make it even easier to give very specific feedback. The way we figure out how to nudge a given individual, there's a lot of signals we take in. So what does the organization want to work on? A lot of organizations are trying to be more innovative, more inclusive. What does the individual want to work on? So you're not going to be motivated to act on the nudge if it has no personal relevance to you. And then what is the team and the manager working on? And there's these big high-level themes, but there's usually actions, almost always actions, that actually touch on all three of those themes. So let's say the organization wants to be innovative, the individual wants to learn to speak up more in meetings, and the team is working on being inclusive. We might send a nudge to the manager that's like, ask everyone to run an experiment that week, and then come to the next team meeting and share what they did. So now everyone gets a chance to speak up. They're working on experimentation, and it's building inclusivity because we're getting okay with making mistakes and like we're all on the same playing field. What surprised me, I think, is actually how relatively infrequent you can nudge people and still see it have a big effect. So people tend to be really surprised when they hear that we send nudges about once a week. So it's not this barrage of nags or notifications. It's really one small step per week. And we have tested this in settings like call centers where there's very clear success metrics. So productivity is measured by first call resolution rate, net promoter score. And we see that people we nudge, again, only once per week, their scores actually tend to go up over time, much more significantly than people who are not nudged. And again, it's not this onslaught of recommendations. It's just doing one little thing that then has this really big compounding impact over time.
And I want to go back to, I'm so curious to get into your writing work. We're going to do that next, but I have one more question just about something you said earlier around vulnerability and your kind of research on vulnerability and obviously interviewing people and getting different perspectives on how they could show up. Because I think vulnerability is a term that certainly over the last couple of years in leadership, we've used a lot more to describe leadership traits. And, while I think there's definitely merit in that, I think that, there's a balance where on some side, people who by their normal kind of nature of how they operate, they do tend to be more private, less open, and they shouldn't necessarily feel forced to share things if it's not natural and comfortable to them. And then on the other side, you may have people who are very comfortable being an open book and sharing everything. And I'm curious, like from your research, from a leadership perspective, what are your thoughts? Is there a right level of vulnerability, optimal level? I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, it's a great question that I get a lot. And fundamentally, there's not good or bad. So we found that there's a spectrum. And so on one end of the spectrum is under-emoters, which you identified as people who are just not going to share as much. And then there's over-emoters that have no poker face. You know what they're feeling. And what we found is that the best leaders tend to act as even emoters. So it's really useful to know what your base tendency is so that you can kind of correct for it in different situations. You don't need to fundamentally change who you are. So often people will say, in this new era of emotions and vulnerability, I feel like I need a personality transplant. And you don't need a personality transplant. It's more just thinking of opportunities to practice what my co-author Mollie and I call selective vulnerability, which is pairing a moment of openness that builds trust with a path forward. So you're both acknowledging emotions and then showing that you've thought through the situation enough to still be a stable guide for your team. Example might be if there's a round of layoffs and you have to communicate that to the people, who are still at the company. If you're an under-emoter, your tendency might be just to not talk about it or just to be like, layoffs were announced this morning, you're all fine, let's move on. If you're an over-emoter, you might just be like completely distracted for the whole day. But the most effective leaders come into the meeting and say, this is really hard, and it's hard for me to communicate this. I'm feeling this too. I know there's a lot of uncertainty. My door is always open. Here are resources. Here's what I'm planning to do over the next 3 months to make sure that this doesn't happen again and that we're rallying together as a team and that you all feel secure. And so again, it's this balance of speaking to emotions without getting overly emotional and then charting a course for a path forward.
Yeah, I really like that even approach. And I think in particular, a lot of the viewers and listeners of the podcast are in HR and people operations. And they've been on the front lines of seismic event after seismic event after seismic event over the last several years where they have had to play that role. And that not just through layoffs, but external circumstances, internal circumstances, global, socioeconomics, there's so many different things that have been happening in our world that they are often on the front lines of. And so I think that advice is really helpful. Let's talk about your books, because for viewers and listeners, I'm sure many of them have read your books. I'm certainly, whether they know it or not, all of them have seen your illustrations before. And I want to kind of get back. You mentioned your writing partner Mollie. How the two of you connect? How did you kind of come together on this idea when you started working on your first book together?
Yeah, so I say it was maybe my mid-20s. I moved to New York from San Francisco. And I had this admittedly very stereotypical view of New Yorkers, that everyone was going to be abrasive. I was going to be this Californian that just hit the sidewalk and everyone would trample over me. So I, in a panic, called all my friends and said, can you set me up on friend dates with people you know in New York? And Mollie was one of those first friend dates. And she and I are both introverts. We both have very rigorous sleep routines. So like eye mask, fan, white noise machine, earplugs, we're doing it all. So we kind of bonded over that, but then had very similar early career experiences where we got the job that we worked really hard for and then found that we didn't really like it or didn't want it or wanted to do something different. And at the time I was doing illustration work on the side. She was writing articles. And so we decided to just write something together about being introverts in an extroverted workplace. And then that first article got a lot of traction. And eventually I had been talking to a book agent, and then it was just so easy to work with Mollie that we were exploring what would be a topic for a heavier book. And Susan Cain had written Quiet, which is all about introverts. So we were like, she has done an excellent job on that. So we need to come up with something different. And realized that the core of everything we had talked about was just emotions at work, which was something that was starting to be talked about more, but still there was a lot of stigma around it, a lot of questions that we had. So we set out to write the book that we wish we had been given when we entered the workplace.
Yeah, so when you went down that path, and obviously, working on a book together, I imagine doing a tremendous amount of research and interviews. What maybe surprised you the most as you really started to kind of go deep in your research for the book on the intersection of emotions and work? Were there certain things that maybe you kind of always held to be true and your research found actually were very different?
Yeah, there's one study in particular that still sticks out in my mind. So again, I studied math and economics in college, and junior year I was very set on at one point becoming an investment banker. And I just assumed that there were some work cultures where the managing director threw coffee against the wall and slammed the notebook on the table. And that was just what culture looked like and what you had to do to be successful in that environment. And there's a study that looks at hedge fund managers. And they actually found that hedge fund managers who are throwing the coffee against the wall, slamming the notebook on the table, their teams actually have much lower returns on investments than the teams of managers who are supportive, encouraging people to ask questions, making it okay to admit mistakes. So that to me was different because I thought, of course you could, Google cares about emotions because there's a ball pit in the lobby, but Goldman Sachs, I don't know if it really works there. And it does. So it actually does make a difference. And this shows up too, among firefighters and hospitals. So I think something that I hadn't even really consciously thought about was that the things we write about hold true in every single kind of environment. The exact ways that they show up might look a little different, but fundamentally people are motivated by being treated well.
And I'd love to learn more about kind of your and Mollie's creative process. The books are fantastic. And I think my gateway to the books were your illustrations. And it felt like, again, your handle, Liz and Mollie on Instagram, and obviously those get shared out all over social media. But I felt like there was you had this ability to connect the illustration, the words of framing to the moments that we were experiencing. And I say moments broadly as society, but particularly as it relates to, the workforce and employees. And I think a lot of that, maybe I'm more attuned to even the feelings of HR, because oftentimes we're on the front lines of all of these things, but they just felt like time after time again, I would see it, and it would link to this moment and this collective experience that we were feeling. And I think that's why it resonated so much, especially in the field of HR. And I would love to know, like, how do one of those illustrations come to be? What is the process of, like, where do the ideas come from? Are they led first with, words and then illustrations to match, or vice versa? Or is it collaborative? Like, I'd really love to go deep in the creative process of how those come to be.
Yeah, so I do the illustrations, and then Mollie and I partner on the writing, so on the book writing. And I think the illustrations are essentially, they definitely started out and still continue to be my therapy. One thing as a manager, and what I've heard from a lot of people in HR is this, someone described it as this concept of burnout, where they say, I'm having to take care of everyone else while going through everything that they're going through. And so it's this added layer of exhaustion and emotional labor. And that, I think if I weren't doing that myself, I don't think that I would really have clued into that. And that's shown up in some illustrations. The specific process is usually, it does start with words. So someone will like burnout, or someone will be like, I just had a really people-pleasing week. And then it's usually just themes that I hear that I'm feeling a lot that other people are articulating. And then on weekends, I have like a Google Drive with lots of different visuals, like stop signs, the Mona Lisa, Sisyphus pushing the big rock up the hill. And then I'll start to be like, okay, here's kind of the words that I'm hearing people say, or the themes. And then which of these visuals make the most sense as a way to represent that. And then it's kind of like my brain does stuff, and but that's like the structure that I have in place around it.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting to hear how they come together. So I appreciate that. And, originally I wanted to ask you if you had a favorite illustration. I'm not going to do that because that's not fair. But I will ask, like, I know a lot of these, the illustrations come from a place of personal resonance, with you, either through, direct feelings and experiences you're having, or those that you're exposed to in your work from your, friends and community. Is there a particular illustration that you have just a deeper kind of emotional connection to, that when you look back on it even now, it maybe takes you back to that time where you can kind of relive what you were experiencing when you created it?
Yeah. The one that pops into my head is this Venn diagram. So it's 3 circles, and it basically has different combinations of, oh my God. So it says like, oh my God, God, oh God. And then in the very middle, it says, oh my God. And I remember that one I created, I think it was in the summer of 2020. And I feel like now this is just the new normal, but it just had felt like the news it was like an onslaught of upsetting headlines. It was COVID, people not caring about COVID, George Floyd, protests. Like, I don't even remember everything that was in the news, but it really felt like every single day I would just open my computer and it was like, oh my God. And that one, I think the kind of sad part about it is that I've just seen people continue to share that. And so it's just like, okay, it wasn't just a moment in time. I mean, it was a moment in time, but then it feels like that's been the sentiment that we've been living through for years now.
I mean, it's definitely an evergreen, illustration, unfortunately. And I mean, we're recording this 1 week, less than 1 week actually, after the Supreme Court announcement essentially revoked the ruling on Roe versus Wade and stripped reproductive freedoms for millions of Americans. And, we're still very much in that raw, emotionally charged period after that. And I say period, this is not something that I imagine is going to be kind of time bound. And there's a lot of people that are fearful and still dealing with the emotions from, disbelief to rage and everything in between of that decision, and many others that are fearful of the precedent that this may set from a legal perspective on the further erosion of freedoms. And so, I'm curious if, even when this runs, we'll see, as you mentioned, evergreen post before, we'll see what happens between now and then, in terms of other moments that are going to be causing, pain, in many of our employees. If managers are listening, and I think most, good managers are going to want to be creating an environment where they're giving their employees, space to grieve, support, all the things they necessary to carry those heightened and raw emotions into the workplace, which, many of us are doing right now. What can they do to create an environment that is, more accepting, more accommodating, more supportive for employees who are going through kind of heightened, emotional reactions to external events?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think often there's a tendency to not say anything because it's like, I don't have the answers. I don't, know exactly what I can do as a leader to immediately support my team, given these huge structural changes. But I think the first thing is definitely just not pretending like it's business as usual. So sort of getting clear on your own values as a leader, and then also your organization's policies, especially in the Roe v. Wade decision, a lot of organizations have added to their benefits or changed their benefits. So I think it's saying something, but then striking a balance between creating space for people to talk if they want to, but also respecting that people are going to have very different reactions. So I felt this actually when the ruling first came out. And I went on my company's Slack, and I love, Humu's very socially active. People feel very safe speaking, and I love that. And then I did have this initial moment of I just want 1 hour where I don't even have to think about this. I kind of just want to be able to escape into my work for an hour. And that's, many people will have that reaction. So I think it's saying something in a meeting or sending out an email and saying hey, here's what happened. I know a lot of you are going to have strong reactions. I'm feeling it too. My door is always open. Please let me know how I can support you. So again, you're creating space for people to need different things. Some might want to know, is there going to be a conversation? Can I join an employee resource group discussion? Some people might say, I just want to do heads down work this afternoon and not talk about it and not answer emails and just tune everything out for a little bit. So I think it's communicating, acknowledging the emotions in the room, making it clear that you're there to support people, making it clear how they can reach out and get that support, but also not putting them on the spot or forcing everyone to say something right away. Because I think in the wake of these events where we do have these very, very heightened, intense emotions, a lot of people aren't going to know what to say yet, or just have a different reaction than the other people on their team. And that needs to be okay too. People grieve in different ways. People get upset in different ways. And so there should be space to accommodate that.
Yeah. Well, Liz, I really appreciate you walking us through your background, your work at Humu, your editorial work, and just your creative process. I really appreciate you making time to share that with me. And for audiences, the readers and listeners that want to order a copy of either of your books, connect with you on social, what is the best way for them to connect with you after the show?
Yeah, I think the easiest is just to go to Liz and Mollie, so Liz, and then Mollie is Mollie, so slightly different spelling than Y. LizandMollie.com. We have assessments on there, links to all our social presences. And then to learn more about nudges, it's just Humu, Humu.com.
Okay. Well, Liz, thank you so much for making time to join me on the podcast. I really appreciate it. And I continue to look forward to more of your work.
Yeah, thanks for having me and for making space for these conversations.